Good morning, colleagues. Nice to hear a Spitfire-like rattle of conversation and repartee going on, particularly on an extreme fire day. So we have to all be sensible today. The conference has done a risk management and it's told you all to wear a hat. You've all got a hat, haven't you? Oh, which state do you come from? Well, as the gardeners say to the director when he's out in the grounds, hug the shade, Richard, hug the shade. Where's your hat? There will be some slip, slop, slap on the bus for those who have fair skin like me. And your bus captain, who is Fiona, will be checking you on. So if you aren't travelling on the motor coach, with all of us, because you've made some other kind of plan, will you make sure at morning tea that Fiona knows how you're intending to travel, or if you're not coming at all. We've got some great treats for you this afternoon. It is 2 or 3 and sometimes 4 degrees cooler in the hills, or the particular piece of the hills that we're going to this afternoon. So that's the domestics. You've all found coffee in the toilets, and if you haven't, I'm sure animal instinct will lead you to them. My task this morning is to introduce Marcelle Scott, who is going to baton change and introduce all the speakers. She's a conservator and she's the academic programs coordinator at the Centre for Cultural Materials Conservation at University of Melbourne. She specialises in objects conservation, has a graduate diploma in archaeology, of all things. She joined the Centre in 2001, has been responsible for developing and delivering teaching and research programs. Marcelle's had a long and distinguished career for one so young in conservation profession, working in state institutions and with community museums. She was national president of the AICCM. I know it goes on and on and on. It's wonderful. She's embarrassed. She's the editor of the peer review bulletin from that organisation. She's the recipient of the 2006 University of Melbourne's Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And she has a string of publications and other honours and glories. She's also, for her sins, a trustee of the Copland Foundation. Please welcome Marcelle to introduce the speakers this morning.
Thank you very much, Richard. She's also now responsible for setting us overtime already for this morning's session due to that introduction. Thank you, Caroline. This is the first time I've spoken at the conference, so I would like to acknowledge Georgina's gracious welcome to country yesterday and to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the original inhabitants of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. Well, it's my very great pleasure to be chairing this morning's session, and I'll get on to things, proceedings immediately. I'll be trying to be very strict with timing so that we don't miss the motor coach at 12 o'clock today and you have time for refreshments. So welcome to Lizzie Anya-Petrivna, who is our first speaker this morning. Lizzie's a Melbourne-based museum professional and specialises in caring for house collections, and since 2004 she's been holding the position of Curator of Cultural Collections with the National Trust in Victoria. She is a lecturer and a PhD candidate in fashion history at RMIT and combines that aspect with conservation and collection management of textile collections, particularly fashion and costume. Recently been responsible for groundbreaking exhibitions that link the Trust's collections with fashion, photography and designers, and Lizzie's talk will focus on that aspect of it today. Lizzie is an Attingham alumnus, and I ask you to welcome her to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelle, for that introduction, and thank you to Richard and his team for organising such an amazing conference, and of course to the Copland Foundation. Today I'll be speaking about 4 exhibitions that were held over 3 months each at Como. So they occupied Como for a time, and then the house was put back together after the exhibition. I'm not going to go into too much depth about the significance of Como. I think that's implied. When the Trust embarked on its first fashion exhibition, staged at Como Historic House, the intent was to try to revive the house's fortune. The result was to inspire a further 3 exhibitions and a strong interest in the Trust's historic fashion collection, sort of reaffirming its status in the Trust's portfolio. The Trust has 5 discrete collections not connected to place with no direct provenance to any of our properties. The costumes, the cane tool collection, the cast iron collection and the carriage collection, as well as a general Trust pool of items. So how does the Trust sort of interpret these ancillary collections? The 4 exhibitions today that I'll be describing today developed kind of almost as a sort of series of catalytic events. I think the word catalyst here, or catalytic, is really accurate in this context, because once the exhibition program sort of was underway, a real momentum was generated. One exhibition, staged well, sort of sparked more attention, and that precipitated new introductions and morphed into creative ideas and collaborations. So it was all very much about partnerships. The process had a kind of energy and a flowing, spontaneous dynamic to it that allowed the Trust to be really responsive and open to opportunities. So working with sort of fashion models, emerging and established curators, designers, students and academics, artists, poets, DJs, scientists, pin-up models. It was just to name a few people that we sort of collaborated with. So in other words, I'm going to probably spend most of my allotted time today name dropping. So as I sort of tell this narrative of the 4 exhibitions. So the 4 exhibitions were Fabulous, Noble Rot, an alternate view of fashion, Shaping Elegance, Robert Fritzlar, and Mannequin, Models, Melbourne Fashion. I might just click on that so it starts to load. By cultivating these partnerships and encouraging participation, I'm going to use that word a lot, and also having some fluidity and leeway in how the exhibitions were planned, meant we could be opportunistic in the best possible way. The success of an exhibition program, I think, can be measured by what I call the participation of an involved audience. Now, I'm not a marketer, so I've just kind of made that term up. And if anyone can kind of correct me and find a better way of describing this audience, it's an audience who've kind of observed what we do and what we've done, and they've come back and they've come to work with us. And so they also promote our work out into the public sphere. So the best contributions this audience have made was to advocate on our behalf, and in the most important of ways, word of mouth, by personal recommendation and by endorsement. And I guess, we are talking about encouraging new audiences, engaging with different demographics. So, having these people champion our cause was really, really important. This has given us publicity in places that we thought we'd never, ever appear. We're not, these are sort of more cutting-edge publications, cutting-edge designers. And we had blog posts written about us, unsolicited support on social media. And this involvement was genuine and was not a kind of orchestrated marketing strategy, sort of just groundswell, and we also engaged with an audience that sometimes can be a bit cynical about how they're being marketed to, and an audience that wants to discover things for themselves. It was sincere and it was genuine, and it was also on a personal scale, which I think is really important. We don't have a lot of money to promote our shows, and when you make an investment to put something like this on, you've got to have that return. It's just the reality of it. We also operate in a kind of lo-fi kind of do-it-yourself ethos as well, because we had such a small staff. I think also the way that the collection gets discussed is interesting. The language used often to describe it sort of frames it in metaphors of secrecy and concealment. This is the costume collection, sort of hidden away from the public. The costume collection is awaiting this sort of revelation. It's in hibernation, inaccessible. And the charm of discovery is therefore heightened. So when it does come out of storage, people are really interested. It's also a kind of language that was sort of fostered by the Trust from about the 1980s onwards, and each decade seems to, find the costumes anew. Most recently, the collection received publicity that sort of reinforced this sense of sort of confidentiality, being let in on a secret. And the publication was broadsheet, and it chronicles the fashion, food and sort of events in both Melbourne and Sydney, so we featured in the Melbourne publication. And what broadsheet are about, to quote them, is they're excited about, not in the breathless and imprecise what they are, to quote, excited about is not the breathless and imprecise hyperbole, but the specifics. We started broadsheet to explore the specifics of what is happening in this city and how this relates to those of us that live here. And the tone taken by the journalist James Cameron in his article on the collection can be summed up in this quote: "An afternoon game of show and tell in a historic house in Caulfield, opening up cupboards and trunks full of costumes." And I think this perfectly exemplifies the appeal and personal sort of small-scale approach that has helped us. And to use broadsheet's words, to engage with the specifics and attract the attention of a sector of the audience who don't find their information in traditional ways. So there's a suite of absolutely lovely images that were taken at Labassa in the costume collection. So there's Labassa. And, without a large amount of funding, the costume collection really can't be activated. So by extending this awareness of its importance, we can start to dream a future for it. Not sure what form it'll take, but look, we're starting to dream, and I think having that optimism is really, really important. And this is also where the exhibitions have helped. The collection's strengths. The collection's strengths are in the holdings of mainly women's garments from the 1850s to the 1920s, and we're starting to build a stronger holding in the mid-century design, mid-20th century design. And I'd also like to just quickly take the opportunity to provide some background on why the Trust began collecting costume, or at least a kind of insight. So, how does fashion sit within the collecting ambit of a heritage organisation? Historic houses, fashion, what is the relevance? Why promote it through an exhibition program? Briefly, the Trust costume collection was always intended for display in a costume museum, as well as for use as props to dress the houses. Mrs Elizabeth Goss, volunteer chairperson of the Trust Collections Committee, was responsible for acquisitions and interpretations of the houses with, of course, the committee. And in 1961, when the first acquisition register was started, the very first accession was a donation of 1850s and 60s fashion from the Mrs Sage. So it's on the first page, number 1. This collecting began amid an international interest in costume and historic dress at the time. This sort of mid-century enthusiasm for costume history was prolific, with the canonic, if sometimes problematic, texts on fashion history being published by people like James Laver. And also the influence of Doris Langley Moore, whose series of books on fashion, her sort of pioneering early colour documentary on the BBC, and if you can YouTube that, it's just such a great documentary. Apparently the Queen Mum was the first to view this colour television documentary. It's quite wonderful. And her personal collection, which became the inaugural collection, of course, of the Bath Costume Museum. And I want to digress slightly here to stay on the topic of Langley Moore. I'm currently researching her influence in Australia, and in particular on the Trust's collection and its decision to begin collecting. Internal memos indicate a close watch on overseas, and I just find the decade of interest. There's so much happening, I guess, both in heritage and in interest in fashion history in the 1960s. So there's this kind of almost contemporaneous genesis with, the Bath Costume Museum and I guess of Mrs. Goss collecting costume. And Langley Moore also toured her collection to Australia in the very late 40s and was a very well-known figure here in Australia. And I make this point because it shows that the Trust's collection did not start in isolation. And I'll just flick through some images that Broadsheet took of some items that are in the collection. This is also at a time when, it positions the collecting ambit in a very interesting contextual place because at the time no major Victorian public institutions were collecting historic dress in the way that the Trust was. Museum Victoria apparently didn't begin collecting social history items until 1984. I don't know how true that is. I read that from a report. So, and the National Gallery of Victoria were only accepting textiles as art or European haute couture. So the Trust was sort of scooping up a treasure of locally made and worn fashion. Many with labels from Melbourne, as well as from department stores, and examples of everyday wear. So this is a repository of sort of social history items. This cache of fashion has always sort of seemed to hold a very sort of particular status in the Trust collections as well. I think it's been really treasured by the curators, and I know Peter Struthers who was a Attingham alumni, also was very, very passionate about the costume collection. So it's sort of close to a lot of people's hearts. The Trust still struggles with finding long-term solutions to our storage problems and all of those sorts of issues. But, I think that, these are unique and, I think everyone can relate to the fact that costume is can be difficult. So to the exhibitions, I might flip back to my Prezi. Might flip through because I'm noticing that I'm going to go over time. You're probably all familiar with the term dressing the house. And outside of the historic house sector, it elicits some really fascinating reactions from fashion theorists and designers, usually in the form of a kind of recognition as a sense of an ephemeral transformation or a disguise. Dressing the house and dressing the body have a kind of tentative connection in this recognition, I feel, sort of as an applied decoration or a clothed aspect, and with the assumption of an identity, a scenario, or, a style. And I wanted to play with this conceit a little when considering the exhibitions for this paper, because in making this analogy, I kind of see dressing a house for a fashion exhibition more like perhaps donning a fancy dress. So why Como? You can see I've got a suite of images of Como used in fashion photography of the 1960s. What are Como's fashion credentials? The initial reason was quite prosaic and practical: attract visitors to an exhausted property suffering from declining numbers. It was a straightforward aim, we thought. I remember being a little bit apprehensive about this. The first show curated was fabulous Melbourne fashion of the 1960s. How did this connect with Como's heritage? What was the fashion inheritance that could be found in Como's history of a wealthy squatter and his family? Because the show was initially proposed for a small gallery at Tasma Terrace at the Trust headquarters. Como was suggested by a member of the senior management team at the time, Tony Lee, and on closer consideration, as a site for fashion, Como began to make sense. The Armitage family, most obviously, provided wool for textiles, to the textile trades, but they also participated in the high fashion of the colony as members of the vice-regal set. Caroline Armitage employed a full-time needlewoman on the estate. The Como collection contains remnants of, French silk dress fabric, partially made garments, trim, accessories, even a pair of ballroom slippers that are ready to be cut out and sewn. So beautiful sort of ephemeral remnant collection. Subsequent research by historian Dennis Green has also discovered a direct branch of the family was involved in the very early manufacture of lace in France. So we're sort of just building a little bit of a picture here. So perhaps it could be argued that this offers a context for historic fashion, but the 1950s, 60s, how does that sit with that? It's a heyday. It's the heyday of heritage and of community interest in heritage. The newly formed Trust, Como is the flagship and the headquarters of the early Trust. Could we conceive that these 1960s fashion styles worn to events at Como promoting heritage, could we kind of imagine that context? You know, I might be, you know, drawing a long bow, but I didn't feel so and I still don't. And also, you know, we have, say, these images by Athol Smith. Athol Smith also took the photographs inside Como when the doors first opened to the public, when the furnishing committee finished dressing the house. So, and he's there taking photographs of the historic interiors, and he's there taking high fashion photographs. I really like that. So I just want to whiz through a few of his photos, the two of Diane Masters, and also by looking at mid-century fashion and the photography and image making of the time, most of the images are placed in very sort of similar environments. You know, girandoles and gilt mirrors and consoles all form a kind of backdrop. And, you know, many of the salons of the designers were featured interiors similar in style and pretension, sort of, you know, to Como's. So, you know, there was this compatibility. And, you know, Como still continues to be a really popular site for fashion photography. So this is a model, Jan Stewart, taken in Como by, we think, Henry Talbot, who was working with Helmut Newton. I think Helmut Newton was actually out of the country at the time, but was still part of the studio. She's actually wearing couture by Robert Fritzlaff. We discovered that when we were researching for the last exhibition. Isn't that wonderful? So what began as a one-off exhibition in 2005 extended into a trilogy over the next 6 years. 3 thematically related shows, staged roughly 2 years apart, that explored 3 facets of fashion production in post-war Melbourne. The first, Fabulous, told the story of the workroom, the attendant craftsperson making exquisite luxury items, who was often anonymous and unnamed, on the final garment. From the back room, we moved into the salon, and the salon of the couturier, and the design process, together with the conditions of fashion production in Melbourne, via the experience of one designer in the show Shaping Elegance. And then we finally moved to the public face of fashion, and the models who promoted the garments, the photographers with whom they worked, and the techniques used to achieve the ideal fashion image in mannequin. And the show, the suite of shows sort of pivoted around one object, the winner of Gown of the Year, 1962. Entitled Venetian Mask, it was a simple column-shaped gown made from layers of tulle and with an angular midnight blue organza cape. The evening dress and cape are now in the National Trust's costume collection. It was embroidered by Nellie Van Rysort in her backyard studio for Fabulous, and featured in Fabulous. The wisteria is quite exquisite. It's sort of rendered in sort of glass crystal. And it was designed by Robert Fritzlaff, who was the subject of the second show, Shaping Elegance, and it was worn on the runway by Janice Wakely, who figured in the third exhibition, Mannequin. So this was kind of the core object, and we displayed it 3 times. And it was kind of nice to sort of build the show around that as well. To my approach, and you can correct me because I haven't sort of seen this approach taken in the sort of sense of using a series of exhibitions to concentrate on one big theme. Can anyone find any examples? Sorry? No? Oh, okay.
Well, the National Gallery of Victoria did a series of fashion exhibitions looking at the history of fashion and the connection of textiles and art across time.
Right.
In a series of exhibitions in the 1990s and 2000s.
Right.
So that's the other example.
Okay, good. I still think also a publication would be good to unify these 3 shows. This approach also consolidated resources, most notably the time spent on research, which is always a precious commodity. The full utilisation of the connections made from subsequent shows, such as working with contemporary designers and collaborators, publicity contacts, exhibition hardware such as body forms and showcases which could be purchased, added to with each show, sort of building really important infrastructure. And this is just the capacity, gives us capacity to put these shows on. And also successful grant applications. we were developing a reputation, and it was starting to really sort of show in actual tangible ways, like getting money. Not a lot, but, enough to sort of stage the next show. So Fabulous, it's hard to lean across it. Maybe I'll move that over here. Fabulous centred on the work of haute couture embroiderer Nellie Van Rysort, whose collection of samples and scrapbooks were donated to the Trust in 2003-04. Born in Holland, Van Rysort had been trained in Paris and worked for Dior and Maggie Roof, amongst others, and immigrated to Melbourne in 1956, the year of the Olympics. In true French haute couture tradition, she archived every design she ever produced, even keeping them locked in a case under her bed. Her daughter Iris Norton donated the scrapbooks after her mother's death, and I think that's the only way that she would have parted with her designs. As an attendant craftsperson, Nellie operated under her label Fabienne. She continued to embroider, sending work back to Parisian couture houses, but also made for private clients like Edith Piaf. Iris tells a wonderful story of her mother working on extravagant embroideries whilst cows were herded past their home in a new outer suburb of Melbourne. Of course, Van Rysort made for all of the leading designers and fashion houses in Melbourne: Le Louvre, La Petite, Hall Ludlow and Robert Fritzlaff. She kept meticulous records and was suitably proud of her work, documenting visual evidence of most of her finished garments. So when a piece was featured in the society pages, she would send off and get the photographs, and thereby building up even more of her archive and documenting her practice. Nellie's scrapbooks are a remarkable repository of local fashion, capturing mid-century Melbourne through an inventory of clients, designers, celebrities, suppliers, etc., etc. It also, I guess, brought together a really significant team of volunteers that have continued on to be the kind of absolute sort of fundamental core of the project. Nance Howen and Libby Howcroft. They not only just, not only do they volunteer on a regular basis with the collection, they also have started fundraising and have hosted a series of very, very successful vintage clothing sales. The last pop-up vintage clothing sale was in the Como Ballroom and made $14,000 in 2 days, which I thought was a pretty phenomenal sum. So Howen and Howcroft were very important to tracking down all of Nellie's former clients, and so then an exhibition could be curated from all of this material. It was important to me to incorporate a contemporary element, to work with contemporary designers. It's a piece of Nellie's work. And I wanted to work with 3 designers, Melbourne designers, and ask them to respond to Nellie's practice to impart a sense of continuity and legacy. I said very blithely, didn't think about it, just rang a designer who I'd been really admiring for a long time, Gwendolyn Birkin, having seen many of her parades and collaborations with milliner, of course, milliner Richard Nylon. The pair have an affinity with the rich textured look of Nellie's embroidery and are playful and whimsical with how they use a sense of nostalgia in their work. They responded strongly to Nellie's handiwork and agreed to create a gown and a headpiece. In exchange, Richard and Gwendolyn asked that promotional photographs of the gown and hat be taken to Como. So they weren't paid at all. This is them giving. And, the trade was I had to organise the hair and makeup and photographer, just do that. And it was through sponsorship, but by using their connections, it ended up being quite a simple task. And that, to me, in some way, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. Just sort of how suddenly these sort of doors started opening. Gwendolyn also suggested that I approach Tony Matichevsky. His gown is the pearl draped piece there. He lent this evening gown, which was being featured in most of the fashion magazines at the time. And he now has a worldwide profile, dressing people like Kim Kardashian. Now, I never thought there'd be a 1 degree separation there. He's often in the press and has generously mentioned the costume collection and Como and the Trust in his interviews, and he sometimes asked me to supply a quote. So I think that sort of support is really, really generous. Became a member of the National Trust Costume Collection Subcommittee, which unfortunately is no longer sitting, and he has given his time in fundraising when we hosted events to capitalise on the interest in the exhibition. He also took on a far more active role in the next exhibition, Shaping Elegance, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So visitation to Fabulous was strong, and the rise of visitor figures seemed to sort of justify the expense. And of course, the real benefits, I think, were to make themselves known in the coming years. We didn't get any grant funds for Fabulous. The Trust funded that itself. We received $2,000 from a company called Mariah George, who had historically supplied Nellie with her beads. So it was like an investment. And then the next two exhibitions were funded by the City of Stonington, whilst Shaping Elegance also had support from the Ian Potter Foundation. So we could prove a sound business case with visitation figures, proof of media interest and capacity to deliver. And this also led to a kind of evolution of installation practice. So with each exhibition, the question of how to dress Como for exhibition was advanced and developed, becoming more ambitious with each installation. So Fabulous was incorporated into Como, and I'll just whiz through some images. And it was made recessive through the inventive use of lighting and projections. The exhibition was instead an overlay. It didn't obliterate the room furnishings and the intent of the rooms. The bedrooms remained bedrooms, etc. What the installation achieved by merging the two experiences was a little more nuanced. Light artist Ian DeGrucci did the projections, and he was a delight to work with. He again really responded to the sort of textual element of Nellie's work and the sort of sense of embroidering the walls with Nellie's designs. And as I mentioned, Shaping Elegance profiled the designer Robert Fritzlaff, and who, despite a successful career, had been sort of largely forgotten. So the intent to reclaim his importance to local fashion history was sort of a very significant exhibition narrative. And then we were presented with the challenge, how do we compete with the success of the projections of Fabulous? Because the atmosphere, elusive and effective, was one of the single most remarked aspects about Fabulous. That's what the public really, really enjoyed, sort of being enveloped in these spaces. And also without overwhelming the garments and the sort of sense of being at Como. So the City of Stonington funded the cost of an exhibition designer, and so I worked with two designers, Tony Matichevsky, who co-curated with me, and it was really interesting to sort of work with a designer that was sort of a couturier from the 50s, 60s and 70s, and a contemporary designer working within a similar sort of framework, and also a designer called Ryan Russell. Ryan used this hero image as the basis for his take on the installation, and he, I'll go to his website because he's just got some of the most beautiful images on his website. And it's Janice Wakely standing in front of a wall of bric-a-brac in an antique store. And the Como collection itself was arranged as a backdrop, as a wall of furniture, sort of corresponding to the colour theme of the rooms. The success of this was to surprise me because it really changed the context of the sense of the collection and what the assemblage means. It refreshed the viewing of the collection by removing it from a room tableau arrangement. So dressing Como in this instance, in this kind of witty way of turning it into an antique showroom, which was quite humorous as well, was quite a wonderful thing. One of my favourite rooms was the sort of stylised reproduction of Robert Fritzlaff's studio. The last exhibition of the trilogy had a very different proposition, was a very different proposition. Senior management boldly decided to give me the brief to remove Como and the furniture placed into storage. All shows had some items removed, mainly so we could open up the 1860s upstairs reception room. And I have to say the guides kind of liked this, which was interesting, particularly when we did open up the upstairs room. Como was completely occupied by the exhibition. Walls were built with large-scale graphic panels. decorative features and overmantel mirrors, light sconces and consoles were all incorporated. And the printed page and image was the sort of the chief design aspect. So we sort of had this light box. We had this kind of idea of this metaphorical model's case with all of their equipment sort of bursting out of it, because models had to do all of their hair and makeup back in the 50s and 60s. So, you know, it was the designer, sort of Mary Callahan, really sort of extended herself with trying to find sort of solutions of how to put these things in. And one thing that I thought was very successful was the sort of the paste ups in the upstairs room. So look, that's all I have time for. I'm sorry. Look, I'm happy to answer any questions and talk about the last exhibition that I didn't have time to, Noble Rot, that we work with Robin Healy with. So thank you very much.
I know it's a sprint more than a marathon, really, to give the presentations under that time frame. We will have questions when we're all together, but thanks a lot for respecting the time frame there.